again. It's good to see you, and to begin our discussion, shall we say, this week. You know, I think the African mind continues to, I think, to be central to the whole perspective of not just Pan-Africanism. Of course, it's Pan-Africanism because Pan-African means, in a sense, everything African and for African people. But the point is that over time, our whole mentality has been transformed by the people who have invaded the continent. And you can look at it from, you know, the most obvious one is the perspective of religion. You know, I think most African people, at least on a day-to-day basis, on a Saturday and Sunday worship days, they're pretty much either Christian or they're Muslim. Depending on which part of the continent it is, you know, northern and eastern, if you will, are by and large Muslim, if not Arab, if not, because along on the western and southern is mostly Christian. And I say that because it's not just a religion that invades a country, but it's a culture that goes along with the religion. Because religion, as we know, is not simply a matter of spirituality, but it's the dogma and the history and everything else, and the rituals and everything else that surrounds the spirituality, which is that we just call the religion. So religion comes with the baggage of culture. That's what I'm trying to get at. And, you know, that has invaded Africa significantly over, you know, almost an interminable period. We don't even have to put numbers to it. And this seeps its way into the mind, because when you have a culture really shapes the individual within the society, because the culture then dictates the educational system, and the educational system transforms the mind of the individual. So here we have, I think, you know, basically I would say that the African mind has been assaulted, if not captured, over, you know, not just even hundreds of years, but maybe even thousands of years, so to speak, certainly in some parts, by foreign influences. And when we look at the problems that Africa faces today, I think we can see that many of those problems are based on those invasions, directly, physically, and the solutions to those problems, or the lack of solutions, is probably also based on the fact that the minds of Africans are still captured by the people who invaded us. The people who invaded us created obstacles to our development within the continent and outside the continent. So we cannot look to them for answers to the problems. So it's like, you know, going in the down escalator, so to speak. You see Africa running harder and harder to try to develop itself. And you see that we still maintain the connection to this external system, as Kwame Nkrumah called it, and I think we have to give him credit for naming it, neocolonialism. And neocolonialism is simply a continuation of a mindset that is non-African. It's European on the one hand, or it's Arabic or Muslim on the other hand. And we have to fight now then to identify the African mind, or create the African mind, or discover the African mind. Give me your take on that in terms of the historicity of this problem, and then we can sort of talk about then how do we deal with the mindset from the educational point of view?
Good question, sir. When it comes to what our recent history of being conquered, colonized, enslaved, and so there has been the creation of an antidote that began with some of the radical Black psychologists. And what they did was to analyze what did our problems look like from a psychological perspective, and they charted certain ways forward. And one psychologist who was way ahead of the game was Monsieur Frantz Fanon, who was from Martinique, born in 1925. And many people see him as the founder of radical Black psychology. And how he analyzed our problem, he looked at it like this. Essentially, colonized minds have been disorientated by two factors. The one is the imposition of European culture, which has been imposed on a population. And with European culture comes European languages, and with European languages comes what the philosophers called the European ontology. What is important from a European perspective, what's not important. And you end up thinking the same way because you're using their language. And then the second thing that has been imposed on colonized minds is the imposition of color prejudice, or as Monsieur Fanon wants to call it, the imposition of whiteness. And then with that imposition, all of a sudden, Blackness becomes ugly. Blackness becomes second class. Blackness becomes what you're running away from. And then with the imposition of European culture, African culture becomes second class. African culture becomes what you're running away from. African languages don't become sources of pride, they become sources of shame, because if you speak an African language, that means you're backward. That means you didn't go to school. That means you're primitive. And in the Caribbean, where we both originate from, there's this whole idea that if people speak the native Creole, that means that you are a country bumpkin whose parents couldn't afford to send you to school. And not only is it seen negatively, they'll even use the phrase to talk bad. Therefore, what's coming out of your mouth, you were encouraged to feel ashamed of. And then that creates hierarchies where everything European is at the top. The European beauty standard is at the top. The European language is at the top, and so on and so forth. And what Monsieur Fanon was trying to get the conquered and colonized people to see is that situation can be fixed. And in doing so, he gave people in the quote unquote third world, people in the global south, ways of freeing themselves from this colonial domination, and in doing so created radical Black psychology.
Interesting perspective. And of course, you know, as you mentioned, Frantz Fanon came out of the Caribbean, I think it was Martinique. And he was involved with the Algerian Revolution. So he was not simply, and of course he was a psychiatrist, and so he was not simply a dilettante in terms of an intellectual. He was in the middle of the revolution itself, and he understood the damage that the French had done to the Africans, the Algerians, and so he saw that mindset, and he also knew of the negritude movement, which also somehow came out of the Caribbean as well as Senegal with what was his name?
Aimé Césaire.
Caribbean, but
Leopold
Senghor from Senegal, who was a distinguished scholar in France, and they gave him the highest honors and so on and so forth, and thought of himself as a Frenchman because that's the way French colonialism operated. They gave you the notion that you're a Frenchman, of course, and of those who are educated in the French system were the elite blacks, if you will. And basically Senghor, came up with the concept of negritude, which was some kind of a understanding of the psychological difference between the European and the African, whereas the European was the intellectual and the African was the emotional one. And this was the difference between the European and the African. So he intellectualized an inferior position for Africans. And this is what, of course, Fanon was arguing against, because you can't have a successful revolution if you think you're inferior to the people who have oppressed you and are continuing to oppress you, because that's not a revolution at all. You're just going to repeat what it is that your oppressor has done to you. And you can see that in the formulations, many of the formulations that have taken place in Africa, since independence and since the 60s. So Fanon was exactly right in terms of it's a mental attitude, and if you absorb the definitions, the ideas of your colonizer, then you're accepting an inferior position, for yourself. And with that mindset, you can never really be independent. You can really never have an independent nation and be a leader of the masses of the people, because that's not what the imperialist position was over time, and that's not what it still is. And of course, I think we're still, struggling with that in terms of the mindset. And we have not, developed. On the one hand, as you presented, a psychological system, and this is not completely true, but we're still under the domination of the European psychological system to a large extent. No, there are significant movements away from that. And I'm familiar with Linda James Myers as one who has written about this, and is a champion of what she calls optimal psychology, which is really based on an Afrocentric perspective of the mind. And we have to get on to that in a minute to define, what the mind is in terms of different definitions, because I think that's the key point. Meaning that the mind is seen differently in terms of the European as opposed to the African person, and I think that is key to the transformation of the mind, which is what the African is going to need, because his mind has been dominated by European definitions, European psychology, European philosophy, and the whole, intellectual paraphernalia that goes by the name of the educational system of the European, with all of their heroes, whether psychological like Freud and Jung, or intellectual, like Kant and so on. It's a tremendous job, and I don't think that it's been approached significantly. I think, as you mentioned, from the psychological point of view, there is more deconstruction of the European mindset within the African community by people such as I mentioned, Linda James Myers, but there are others that that you know, such as Amos Wilson, who is very, very good as a psychologist and understands the African mind and understands the difference between, understood, I should say, he's now passed, but he's written significantly on it in terms of the fact that one needs a transformation of the mindset in order to be able to function and to create your own reality and not live in somebody else's reality. Because the basis of power, and I think this is almost a quotation from Amos Wilson, is the ability to create your own reality. And he adds to have other people also believe in it. But I believe it's really to create your own reality, because I think each person creates his own reality. And this is the onus of the educational system to create that mental transformation in each individual. And that's the only way you're going to create the transformation within the society. So I think we're kind of back to an educational system, but it's an educational system that understands the psychological dilemma, shall we say, of being involved in a total European perspective of what reality is. And that's what we're dealing with. An absolute reality and not just a virtual reality, but a relative reality, because the relative reality is what you project based on your cultural orientation. The absolute. Yeah, please go ahead.
And this is where I think Dr. Naim Akbar is important, because he calls their reality democratic sanity. Democratic sanity, if enough people act like they believe it, then that's their model of sanity. Let me throw in Naim Akbar, because he's important, I think, in two ways. The first is that he recognizes that a lot of Black people in the West, a lot of our thoughts and behavior are seriously affected by the slave past. And a lot of the outcomes are similar to what Monsieur Fanon talks about once you've been conquered, colonized, and enslaved, where certain aspects of our behavior, such as our attitudes to work, such as our attitudes to property, leadership, playing the clown around Europeans, personal inferiority, family and community divisions, color consciousness, distorted religious imagery, how a lot of that is still present in our behaviors. And this is why so many Black people are on the raccoon train when it comes to politics. But that's part of our behavior, which we can analyze. The other part of our behavior is, as Africans, we do have retentions of ancient culture, because the same Naim Akbar talks about what he calls the Nile Valley origins of the science of the mind, where the whole idea that the spiritual concepts that make up the Book of the Dead, such as the Ka, the Ba, the Kaibit, the Sa, and so on and so forth, these different things that are in the Book of the Dead are actually psychological concepts showing that a modern human is made up of what he calls multiple selves. And this idea of a modern human being made up of multiple selves, this same idea was developed by a Nigerian philosopher in this country called Chukwuniri Kamalu, who wrote the book Person, Divinity, and Nature, where he's comparing traditional African cultures, such as the Yoruba, the Igbo, the Dogon, and so on, their ideas of what makes up the multiple selves of a person with the ancient Egyptian concepts of the multiple selves. And so what that means, if we're analyzing Black people today, some of our behavior is going to be raccoon train behavior, because that's what happens to you when you've been conquered, colonized, enslaved, and so on. But some of our behavior is going to be ancestral behavior. Some of our thinking is going to be ancestral, where we are still thinking in some ways, in ways that our ancestors would have been thinking. And then as we become more and more politically conscious, we move slightly away from the raccoon frame and slightly more towards becoming Pan-African, Afrocentric, Black nationalist, whatever terms you want to move. And then this going from one to the other is this consciousness. And Fanon explains precisely how we can go from one to the other. You know, he's got a model in his book, The Wretched of the Earth. And what happens when people become conscious and how their thinking changes from Eurocentric thinking to the thinking of their own people. And that's what we should be aiming for in how we teach Black psychology and so on. But let me shut up at this point.
No, that's extremely significant in terms of what you've said, and in terms of, you know, Naim Akbar. Certainly, he's one that has pointed out the understanding of the mind in terms of how ancient that was in terms of civilization, and it is rooted really in Nile Valley civilization. I mentioned Liz Myers, she's also involved in that, and it's a matter of the understanding of the mind. And you brought up the not a concept, shall we, but you brought up consciousness as an entity. Well, you know, consciousness is something that the European has not been able to grasp. You understand that? As they say, consciousness is a hard problem. But it's a hard problem because they haven't experienced it. Consciousness is something that you experience. It's not something that you can grasp in a physical sense. And this is their problem. They have tried to define consciousness as an epiphenomenon of neuronal activity in the brain. That's as far as them being able to get to it. So, you know, when their psychology, you know, has gone, you know, through all of these changes, shall we say, from Freud in terms of the subconscious and the unconscious, to Jung, and then to behavioral psychology, et cetera, they're still looking for a physical basis for the mind, for consciousness and the mind. And that physical basis does not exist. And it gets back to the basic difference and misunderstanding of Europeans, in that they think only of materialism, and their thoughts are based on the physical matter, and the information that's brought to them about physical matter through their five senses. They do not have another way to approach nature itself, because nature is bigger than the physical matter. And as a matter of fact, not using a pun or anything, but as a matter of fact, as you know, physical matter is less than 5% of the universe. Most is made up of not matter, if you will. And you can call it anything you want. Nowadays, I think they're calling it the neutron soup or something like that. But or you know, or the universal field, the Akashic field, it was called. But in terms of African terms, it was called the Nun, which really was sort of the watery source of everything, in terms of origin. And it consisted, you know, I don't want to get too heavy into that, but it consists of Amun, which is consciousness itself, and other elements that are basic to creativity and the creation of the universe. But then let's just get to mind, and the fact is, you mentioned some of these things like the bar and the car, and I don't think you mentioned the act, but the act is really the enlightened self that joins the ancestors, or joins Ra, the gods, if you will. But it's a little difficult to speak about, because you have to define each of your terms, and each of the terms need definition because they're symbolic of something else. It's not simply a verbal definition. But basically, it's a matter of understanding that the individual is made up both of spirit and matter. And the Ba, a loose equivalent is the soul, and the Ka, again, a loose equivalent really is the, if you will, the spiritual part of it, meaning the energetic part of the soul. So the Ba and the Ka, have a relationship. At death, at the time of death, the Ba leaves the physical body, and to some extent, part of the Ka relates to the physical body, because obviously, E equals MC squared, in terms of the Ka being energy and the body being matter. So, and you mentioned the what has been called the Book of the Dead, but that has been called that, by Egyptologists who really don't understand what they were dealing with, didn't understand it then, and don't understand it now because of the difference in mindset. It's not the Book of the Dead. It's the book of coming forth into the light. That's a true translation of this book, which is one of the earliest book really, in terms of pyramid text and so on, which goes back to 2500 BC and so on. So it's really a psychological treatise, or if you will, a spiritual treatise. But both are similar, because most of us are develop a mindset, again, out of our culture, out of our educational system. And it may take us away from who we really are as a spiritual source. And the spiritual source that we need to get to is what's called, the Ba, as opposed to, the mind-body complex, which the body is going to die. And the mind is really an artificial structure, because the essence of mind is consciousness, and that was possibly the last thing you said before I started talking just now. It's all about being conscious of consciousness, which is primary, and this is the African understanding of self. Self is a conscious entity, a conscious presence, and that has to do with the Ba and the Ka, if you will, because it's an awareness, consciousness, as well as an energy. And
I'll jump in there, sir.
This is like Shiva and Shakti. Yes, please do.
Here's the thing. When Dr. Chukwunyere Kamalu wrote his book,
yes,
he suggested that the different concepts, the Ka, the Ba, the Ak, the Sa, and so on and so forth, them representing different aspects of the self. Dr. Akbar wrote the book, The Community of Self. And here's the point. According to Chukwunyere Kamalu, one of the aspects that make up the self is the destiny or spiritual double. Another one is the soul, as you say. Another one is the heart. Another one is the spirit, the ancestral guardian, the shadow, whatever. But here's the thing. Here's the point. You see, whenever I've taught that to my students, the obvious question that they ask is, so what? And I believe there's an answer to the so what. Here's what the answer is. When these different entities are organized, they form a singular entity known as the person. That's what makes me, me, and what makes you, you. When this unity breaks down, we no longer have a balanced and centered person. And consequently, by having the concept of multiple selves, or as Akbar would call it, the community of self, if those different entities are organized and coherent, we have mental good health. And when they're not, we have mental ill health. And now, if that idea is valid, it suggests that one of the reasons for spirituality and spiritual development is that could be a part of the treatment of mental ill health. And if that's valid, then our ancestors were very, very clever people indeed. And that's the credit that we should give them for coming up with the concept of multiple selves. And that concept running through not just the ancient Egyptian belief system, but nearly all the traditional African belief systems. Now, running with that same idea, let me quote Dr. Basil Davidson. Dr. Basil Davidson said, and I'm quoting here, "Witch doctoring is written off in the modern world as arrant nonsense, but in traditional Africa, the witch doctor served a real and useful purpose quite apart from his magic. It was not unusual for him to function as a sort of pre-scientific psychologist." Mic drop, Dr. Basil Davidson. So he's seen the same thing. And that, for me, is one of the high points of what we can learn from traditional African belief systems, because ultimately it's giving us a notional model of how to model mental good health and, by implication, mental ill health.
You're, 100%, and correct. And I may have mentioned it previously. But it's very important to deal with it from this perspective that you're talking about. The oldest story that has ever been told, and it goes back to 5000 BC and even before that, as a story before it was written down, is the story in Kemet of Osar, Oset, Seth, Nepsis, and Heru. Now, in a 1 minute run through, basically, this is what Akbar would be talking about in terms of the community of self. It's not different self, the community of self. Basically, what Ausar is the consciousness that anchors you to source. It's your connection to God, if you will. Auset is the consciousness that deals with your five senses and information that you get from outside you as a physical person. Seth is basically the energy aspect of it, sort of the car aspect of who you are. And Nepsis is the perceptive apparatus of the mind, perceives through the five senses. So and then Heru now is the son of Osar and Oset. Story goes, that Osar ruled his kingdom, which was Kemet, and he brought Kemet to civilization. And again, it's a 30-second or 1 minute go through. Along with his wife, Oset. He then left the country to civilize the rest of the world. And the wife took over and was running the world. But then his brother, and whatever, again, it's a community of self, it's a family, because it's really one entity. But because it's different functions of the mind, and it's the first psychology in the world. Also the first understanding of spirituality in terms of a way to bring about transformation of the individual. Okay, so Seth now is the bad guy because he's the energy and he wants to rule things himself. When Alsar comes back now after his travels, Seth kills him, and we're not going to go into a whole bunch of things, but he kills him, puts him in a coffin, and then ends up cutting him up into 14 pieces. And that's just a fragmentation, which is the psychology of ego. That's really is ego. And his wife, Nephthys, has been going along with the process. Now, what happens then is that both Nephthys has a conversion, so to speak, because she's seen what Seth has done. So both Nephthys and Alseth are beside themselves in grief, and they go all over Egypt and picking up the different pieces of Alsar that have been scattered by Seth, put them together. Now this is remembering. Puts together all of the pieces, remembers Alsar, and the key word there is remember, but in terms of memory, but it's done in terms of the physical body, the different pieces of the physical body, because it's symbolic. Each of them has a relationship with Alsar, which obviously, well, I shouldn't say that just yet. The only piece they couldn't find was the penis, which had been thrown into the Nile River and eaten by a fish. I'm not sure entirely the symbolism of that, but the symbolism of the rest of it now is Alseth has a child who is Heru. Okay. And Nephthys has a child who is Anubis, which is very interesting because Anubis is a symbol for transformation. And she herself now has been transformed basically from the wife of Seth. Now she's going to be working with Alseth to grow up Heru, because Heru now she's growing him up so he can inherit the throne, because Seth has taken over control. And just as you mentioned, think of it as a community of self. And this is a battle that's been going on, and it's a mental battle. Now the kingdom, if you will, which is self, is being run by ego, which is Seth. Okay? And but both Nephthys and Alseth remember Alsar. In other words, they remember the good old days when Alsar was in charge, which was, as you mentioned it, this balanced consciousness that was one with the universal consciousness, being one with God, which is how you can be at peace with yourself and with the world and everything else in the world. And they grow up Heru, okay, in the swamp and the Delta region, away from Seth. And now they become strong enough to do battle with Seth. Now, what that means, again, Heru is another aspect of mind. It's the aspect of mind that is concentration, and has been brought up by those two ladies who have remembered, meaning remembering as well as understanding Alsar, which is the oneness of union with God, and they have taught him this, and now he has the strength, which is a concentrated awareness to do battle. The battle takes place over time because, as you know, transformation of the individual is a difficult thing, and you go forward, you go backward, you go forward. Anyway, he defeats Seth. When he defeats Seth, Okay, he doesn't kill Seth, he defeats Seth, and it's a whole long story about pleading his case before the divine nine, nine gods of creation. But we're not going to go into that. But the first thing he does when he defeats Seth and is given the throne is that he goes into what they call it the underworld in terms of the Book of the Dead. It's not the underworld; it's the inner world. Okay, where he resurrects Osar, because Osar has been, quote, dead or asleep or whatever it is. And this and the symbolism of that is he was put in a coffin and he was also thrown in the water. So he was covered over. Osar was covered over. So we have forgotten who we were and who we should be. And that's what all this fight was about. And Heru goes now and resurrects his father. He goes into the inner world. Okay, this is a major point. And he resurrects his father and he opens his father's mouth with an adze. Opening his mouth means now that your true spiritual self can speak to you. Okay? And he inherits the throne. He inherits the throne of his father. So here you have, Alsar who was killed and mummified and put in a coffin and thrown in the water, forgotten. Then he was remembered by a different, aspect of your mind, if you will, and then resurrected over time. All of this is really a significant meditation process. How you can transform yourself through this understanding of the psychology of mind. And now Heru inherits the throne and rules the kingdom wisely with the benefit of Osar's teaching that he is resurrected. This is the first psychology, and you can trace this throughout the rest of the Near East and the Far East and around the world, because all the spiritual traditions come out of that. All the way to Latin America, Quetzalcoatl, and all of that, and all through the Buddhist teaching, all of that is there, and all through the Vedic teaching, it's much the same. So, but Africans are not being given credit for that. Neither the psychology nor the spirituality of it. And when the Europeans talk about spirituality, they say, "Oh, India." Well, it didn't start in India; it started in Africa.
Absolutely.
And it probably went to Mohenjo-daro and into southern India under the pressure of the Caucasian invasion, from Europe into India. And of course, it spread to China and Tibet, etc. And of course, Tibet also has a book of coming forth, like they are, Book of the Dead, they call it. And it's the same type of understanding. So your point is very well taken. And that's the only way we can heal is understanding our spiritual self. But the only way we can understand our spiritual self if we understand the teachings of our ancestors. So we don't believe that, the ego that has been developed within the Western system, because the Western system is based on individual and egocentricity. The stronger your ego is, so to speak, is the more you're going to be able to compete and beat your rival and therefore be successful in gaining whatever, the riches of the world, the more beautiful woman, the most in the world, or whatever it is, get your Nobel Prize. It's all competitive and based on individualism. And individualism is a mind-body concept, that is based on a particular type of thinking that is really materialistic thinking. It has nothing to do with spirituality. And that's why the Western religion really has nothing to do with spirituality. You're supposed to get your spiritual desserts when you die and you go to heaven. In the meantime, behave yourself as a good boy, if you will, or you go on Sunday and you get your what do you call it? Not communion, but a remission of sins or whatever. But the spirituality in Christianity was abolished in terms of the West, particularly since the Council of Nicaea. It flourished on the Eastern Christianity because they believe in the divinization of the human, and that's the African perspective, and that's where the original Christianity, as you know, came from. But and this is what now we have to get back to, as you're saying, this understanding that we're spiritual and physical, and that the mind is the intermediary between the spirit and the body, and it's the spirit that maintains that balance. And all mind is really the functional aspect of spirit or soul, and this is continues in Africa in most situations. Whether it's the Bantu thinking, or you mentioned the Yoruba, and it's also true in the Congo and different places in Africa.
Can I just jump in there, sir?
You get into Pan Africanism unless you have the spiritual reawakening, transform our mind and how we see things. You can't have a true Pan Africanism. I'm sorry, go ahead.
And the point that I was making was bringing this now to what we teach when it comes to our institutions. There's enough material from the likes of Frantz Fanon, the likes of Naim Akbar, the likes of Wade Nobles, the likes of Linda Myers, to Africanize the teaching of how we see ourselves, the likes of Chukanyeri Kamalu, and then, as you said, the breaking down the story of Oser, and Heru, and breaking down exactly what each represents in terms of the community of self. Then we have scholars that have delved into what's the psychology of the oppressor? What are they thinking? And this is where people like Dr. Francis Cresswellsing comes in, Dr. Bobby Wright. And then you've got scholars like Dr. Edwin Nichols, who have looked at what happens when you've got people who are of African heritage come across people who are the oppressors and interact with each other. And then what are the behavioral complications that you could expect when these two groups of people interact? So what this means then is that as we build an alternative psychology, there's enough material to form a pretty solid basis. And the ideas now will be, how do we test the ideas of these great scholars? How do we critique the ideas of these great scholars? And then how do we develop it into curricula that can be used as the basis for what could go into schools, colleges and universities all over the African world? Not to mention what anybody else has to say, because there could be a whole bunch of other scholars that we don't know about yet, who can then add to this burgeoning canon as we create our own heritage that we can use as the basis of our psychology teaching.
Again, what you say is so relevant, that it is an educational process based on an understanding of the psychology of mind, which releases, shall we say, the spirit, which is the creativity of the individual. And it's not a religion, and it's not a religious effort, because as you know, Kemet had no word for religion, and many African societies have no word for religion. This is not going to come about through the church, whatever church it is. Because the understanding has nothing to do with churchiness. and a particular dogma. It has to do with reality and understanding of the reality of who you are fully as a human being. You know, it has nothing to do with spooky wooky business there of some God up there or out there, you know, or some Messiah who came at one time, you know, or made promises to one tribe of people or whatever. All of that is really nonsense. It's the reality of the world that is has always been there from creation, from before the Big Bang, if you will. We can get into that at some other time because Western science have no answer for anything that occurred, well, existed before the Big Bang. All of a sudden, there was a Big Bang. And well, what caused it? We don't know. But but they've been able to find pieces of how matter started. So how did evolution come about? Oh, well, it must have been chance mutations. You end up with a human being. And somebody would say, it's like if you take 10 dictionaries and you throw them up in the air and you expect to come up with a Shakespearean sonnet or Julius Caesar or, you know, one of his efforts, it doesn't make any sense. You know, all of that is really fantasy, shall we say. And the religion itself is based on fantasy. Again, you know, we get back to the dogma of the virgin birth, which we know never existed, and we know that it's a copy of something that occurred in Kemet, an understanding in Kemet, and it's written on the walls there in a temple in Luxor. I think it was Amenhotep III. That's the most explicit one. But you know, there are other images as well in terms of virgin birth, which again was symbolic in terms of how your soul enters, shall we say, the physical body. You know, in terms of your mother's womb and you come into existence. But the point is, which is what you're making, it's an educational process. Because education is the basis of how you teach your culture. It's you know, religion, you know, has taken on a role in certain societies, and certainly in most of our Western societies, religion has taken on a role. But the point is that even in a Western society, you know, maybe I shouldn't say even, but in a Western society, religion is at odds really with education, because most educated people don't believe in their religion, because it's so much nonsense, you see. Whereas what you're talking about, what we are talking about, is an educational system that's based on the reality of who we are and who our ancestors understood us to be, because they were the first human beings, you know, and the first ones that had consciousness and were able to be conscious of consciousness without any of these, you know, cultural appurtenances that came from outside. And with that, shall we say, open mind, they were able to understand themselves and they were able to understand their environment. And, you know, as my dad said, you know, God and nature, you know, first made us what we are. And then our own creative genius, we make ourselves what we want to be. And this is really what it is. It's God, if you will, meaning the whole creative act. You know, that come about, you know, somehow. And the creative act produced nature and it produced us, the highest aspect of evolution. And we're all tied together. But for creative genius, then we make ourselves what we want to be without any of these hindrances, and you know, such as materialism. But if we just manifest what our true nature is, which is a spiritual nature, and the business, we can go back to the bar which again is the soul and leaves the body at the time of death. The bile can be recycled. But if you have truly understood yourself in terms of your spiritual understanding and become one with Ra, which is life, energy, and one of the principles of creation, then you become an Ak, AKH, and you are one of the many stars that you see twinkling in the heavens at night, so to speak. So that's a soul who has been totally liberated and with understanding, and then becomes part of the milieu, doesn't return and goes through, if you believe in reincarnation, which our ancestors did. And I think, it's present in the Vedic literature as well, of reincarnation and coming back until you really get it right. But you need to be in a society that understands just what we're talking about, and then can create an educational system that allows you to do that. Most of us were brought up in an educational system, whether it's the Caribbean or in England there or in the United States, where I'm at present. That is really egocentric, because everything is based on the mind-body concept of an individual who is separate from everything else. You're separate from your parents, you're separate from the community, you're separate from God. God is out there, and this is the basis of your education. So you grow up with this, egocentric approach, trying to make your way in society. And the only way you can make your way in society with everybody else having the same understanding is by competition. You have to try to beat up the next guy to get the goodies. It's intrinsic within a society like that. That's based on materialism and individualism. That there's going to be a competition and conflict. And it's true in the individual, it's true in the society, and as you can see, it's true in the foreign policy. The Europeans have been at war ever since there were Europeans. From the Greeks all the way up to the present time, it's war after war after war. So the understanding, which is materialism, which is scientific materialism, which is a religion that exports its spirituality to heaven and an afterlife, is destroying the planet. And we do need a paradigm shift towards what we're talking about, and we need to incorporate it into an educational system that can bring about the transformation of our people and their health and healing, which is what you mentioned.
Yeah, well said, sir, because here's the thing, the people listening to this, as far as what our scholars have produced, they really have produced a revolution in content. And that revolution in content very much can change what we teach in our colleges, in our institutions, and in our universities. And that should be the core, and then we build other ideas around it. So that becomes a core, and then that becomes where we begin our discussions. And then that is how we revolutionize the teaching of psychology.
Beautiful. I think that's a great note to end that, and we're going to continue that in our next sessions, because I think it's of extreme importance. And maybe we can get one or two people to help us delve deeper into this whole aspect of, well, some people call it Black psychology, but I don't like to use that term. But I would say African psychology and education.